see if my regular people can hear me a little better. That might work, I guess. Well, thank you for having me back. I got more technology here. There we go. All right. Need to put it up a little further. Better. I have such a loud voice that I hurt people's ears. Oh, it's a bad mic, maybe?
Yeah, the batteries are dying.
How's that? That better?
Yeah.
All right. Well, if you couldn't hear me, you wouldn't know what I said, but you would think it was good still.
Technology. More technology.
More technology, yes. All right, well, many years ago, I worked for a farmer. I don't know if anybody here knows him, but we grew Christmas trees, but we would travel around the countryside and plant Christmas trees for other people. And on one job, the trees weren't getting packed in very well. There were 2 wheels on the back of the planter, and so we kept cranking the top rod to the 3-point to put more weight on those wheels. But as we cranked it more and more, we lifted the front end of the planter up out of the ground. And so the seedlings then, they didn't get planted deep enough, so the roots didn't go straight down. They looked more like a J in the channel that was made. Well, summer came, and a very large percentage of those seedlings died. And so the landowner called up and said, well, my seedlings are dying. What's the problem? And so my boss had to make it right with him. And so we went to look at it, and we had to repay him for the cost of the seedlings and for the cost of planting, putting them in for him. And so that was a rather expensive lesson in how not to operate a Christmas tree planter. But it was a good lesson for me that when you mess up, you have to make it right with the person that you messed up with. And so that's what we'll be talking about today in 2 Samuel 21, 1-14. And in that passage, David realizes that there's a problem, and he asks God what the problem is. And God tells him, and so he goes to the people who were the victims of this problem, and he tries to find out what he needs to do to make it right. And they tell him, and even though their solution is shocking to us, David does it for him. And when he's doing this, he also keeps promises that he had made to other people along the way. So I'm getting to the end of 2 Samuel. This is chapter 21, and there's 24 chapters. And I started 1 Samuel back in September of 2023. So I've been in 1 and 2 Samuel for a long, long time, almost 2 years. And here at the end of 2 Samuel, there's 6 stories that talk about the greatness of David's greatness. And chapters 9 to 20 were all about David's personal life, where he kind of went off the rails. But these last chapters are about his public life, what he did as king. And they're not chronologically at the end of David's life. They come here and there throughout his life. This one must have occurred not long after Saul had been killed and David became king. Now these 6 stories, they're written in what's called a chiastic structure. Anybody know what a chiasm is? No, we got one back here. Chi is the Greek letter that looks like X. And so if you took the 6 stories in 21 to 24, the first one will correspond with the last one, and the second one with the second to the last, and then there's 2 in the middle. And if you start on the end and indent for the second one, and indent again for the third one, and then unindent, it looks like the left-hand side of the letter X. And so we call them a chiasm. And often the part that's being emphasized is the part in the middle. So it's good because it emphasizes things, but it's also a good memory device because the Hebrew people, they didn't have a lot of Bibles laying around to take home. And so this helped them memorize or remember what the story was about. Well, the first and last statements show that when there's an offense, David went and did what he had to do to repair the offense, to make amends for the offense. And then the second and fifth one show that even though David's considered a very great man, he always accomplished things by empowering and involving other people in what he was doing. And the third and fourth ones in the middle show that David always relied on God when he was at his best. Now, David didn't always rely on God, but when he was at his best, he relied on God. And since those two are in the middle, those would be the ones that are being emphasized by these last four chapters of the book. At David's best, when he was at his best, David relied on God. So the first part of the chiasm, we have what some people call the offense of Saul and its expiation. Expiation's a good word, or the Lord's wrath against Israel. And so what this story tells us is when there's an offense, we need to discover what the offense is and how we can make amends for it. And it was easy for us when we planted the Christmas trees because the guy called up and said, hey, my Christmas trees are dying. You need to do something about it. And what he wanted my boss to do about it was to pay him the money to compensate him for the trees that were dying. Now, David has a little more difficult time figuring the thing out, as we'll see, and we'll start with 1 to 6. It says, now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year. And David sought the presence of the Lord, and the Lord said, it is because of Saul and his bloody house, because he put the Gibeonites to death. So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the sons of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. And the sons of Israel had made a covenant with them, but Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the sons of Israel and Judah. David said to the Gibeonites, what should I do for you, and how can I make amends so that you will bless the inheritance of the Lord? Then the Gibeonites said to him, for us it is not a matter of silver or gold with Saul or his house, nor is it for us to put anyone to death in Israel. Nevertheless, David said, I will do for you whatever you say. So they said to the king, the man who destroyed us and who planned to eliminate us so that we would not exist within any border of Israel, let 7 men from his sons be given to us, and we will hang them before the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of the Lord. And the king said, I will give them. So David, he noticed something was wrong when they had 3 years of famine. And, that's a big problem when you're reliant on the crops that are produced to live. And so the longer the famine went on, the more difficult it was going to be for his people. And so David's the king, and so it's his job to figure out what the problem is and how to fix it. And so sometimes natural disasters happened in Israel because of the nation's sins, but sometimes they just happened because they happened. Now, Israel had made a covenant with God way back at Mount Sinai, and there were blessings for keeping the covenant, and there were curses for breaking the covenant. And a famine raised the possibility in David's mind that something had gone wrong with breaking a covenant. And so David did what he normally did when he was doing well. He sought the presence of the Lord. He's going to ask God what the problem is. And so they might have used lots, or the priests had Urim and Thummim, little objects that they would throw, and that would tell them what God's will was. Now, if you had a pastor or elders and they were using dice or little objects to decide what to do, you might have problems with that. But that's what they did back then. So God told David that the problem was that Saul had put the Gibeonites to death. And there's no record of this happening in 1 Samuel. So it might have been when Saul killed all the priests at Nob, and he killed everybody else there too, including kids and animals. So he wiped everybody out. But the problem with killing the Gibeonites is that the Israelites had made a covenant with the Gibeonites years before, and it's recorded in Joshua 9:7 and 11:19. And so Saul, who's king of Israel, he has broken this covenant with the Gibeonites. And the covenant had been made before God. Now the story in Joshua 9 is kind of interesting. The Gibeonites tricked the Israelites into making this covenant with them. They dressed up in shabby clothing and acted like they were poor and got the Israelites to make this covenant. But regardless, they had made a covenant, and God expects his people to keep their promises, even if it was a bad covenant. So, God might expect us to keep our bargains, even if it turns out that it's a bad bargain to make. It also says that Saul did this in his zeal for the sons of Israel and Judah. And so his intentions were good. He was trying to make things better for the people of Israel and the people of Judah. And so it also, either he didn't remember about the covenant, it would have been written down in Joshua, so if he had read his Bible, he would have known about it. Or he just didn't care about it, which is more likely. Actually, both are probably likely with Saul. I don't think he spent a lot of time studying the Bible. So he didn't worry about it. He just killed the Gibeonites because that was the thing to do. Now, Romans 12:11 says, "Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord." And so zeal is a good thing. But Galatians 4:18 says, "It's fine to be zealous, provided the purpose is good." And so be zealous about good things, not things that you think are good. Well, God, he doesn't want his people, especially his kings and leaders, he doesn't want them going around breaking covenants that they've made with other people, even if they do it in their zeal for the people. And so he sends this famine to get David's attention. And David goes to the Gibeonites and says, "I'd like to make amends with you." The word is kippur, kafar, and we know Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement, so kafar means to atone. And so in daily life, when we break a promise, we need to go make amends for what we've done. And when you're planting Christmas tree seedlings and you don't do it right and all the seedlings die, well, you're going to have to go make it right with the customer. If you break a contract with someone and don't make amends for it, the other party can haul you into court and ask the judge to give them a remedy, to give them the amends that they should have. Now here, God himself intervenes because the Gibeonites are in no position to make demands about anything. They are essentially the slaves of Israel. So Jesus, he says in Matthew 5:25, "Come to good terms with your accuser quickly while you are with him on the way to court, so that your accuser will not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officers, and you will not be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid the last quadrants." So I used to do work for businesses that sold things to other people, other businesses. I only did it business to business. And sometimes the other business didn't pay. And so my client, they would call up or send a polite letter and say, "Please pay it." And if that didn't do the trick, they'd call me. But then I would send a nice letter to the people and say, "Please pay it." And if they didn't pay or make other arrangements, then I would file a lawsuit. And I would ask what was owed, plus interest, plus attorney fees, plus costs. The other company, the buyer, they really had no leg to stand on because they had bought the stuff but didn't pay for it. And so they would end up with a judgment against them. Now, sometimes they would pay when we got to this point, but sometimes they wouldn't. And when you have a judgment, the judgment creditor can send a thing called a writ of garnishment to a bank. And when the bank gets the writ of garnishment, they'll send all the money they have to the person that sent them this writ. And so one time we sent it out and we scored big. A lot of money came back from the bank. But the guy called up and he says, well, what are you doing? I made all my payroll checks and they bounced. And so it was very bad, very sad for that guy. But he figured out a way to get the money to pay it. Another time we got a judgment, then the other company filed bankruptcy. But for some reason they didn't bankrupt the judgment. I think the judgment was before, so they couldn't really bankrupt it. Years later, they went to sell the property, and lo and behold, there was a judgment against their property. And so it's for the judgment amount plus 1.5% per month for like 8 or 9 years. And for the math wizards in here, if you crank out 1.5% interest for 8 years per month, it adds up. Now my guy, he was merciful and he cut it down to 6%. So they paid the very last penny. And so Jesus was right. Imagine that. If somebody's taking you to court, settle with them before you get to court. No, I don't do that work anymore, that kind of work, because I didn't enjoy it very much. Now the Gibeonites, they don't want money, and they aren't authorized to put anybody to death. And so David says, well, tell me what you want, and I'll do it for you. They want 7 of Saul's sons to be put to death. Now, sons is a generic term for descendants, so some of them would be sons and some could be grandsons. When they get the 7, they say, we're going to hang him before Saul lived in Gibeah. They're going to hang him before the Lord's Hill in Gibeah, where Saul lived. David says, I will give them. So, is that okay? You think that's okay? It's Old Testament. Now, it's a good thing to ask people, we've offended, what can we do to make amends? But we wouldn't want to hand over other people to be killed. What if my boss had said, well, okay, that crew of mine, they really messed up. I'm going to hand them over to you to be killed and hung out in your tree field. Well, that's not going to fly here in America these days. So we pay them money. We pay people money to make things right. Now, the text doesn't say that David asked God whether he should turn over these 7 people or not. Killing sons for the sins of the fathers was against the law of Moses. Deuteronomy 24 says that. And Gleason Archer, he's a good Bible scholar. You got a book of his somewhere up there. I noticed it. He says that since Saul's guilt had not been paid, it had to be visited on 7 of his sons, because that is the number of completeness. 7 is the number of completeness. And Saul had probably killed way more than 7 when he did what he did. So Israel had to learn that they've got to keep the covenants that they make with other people, especially when they make it in the name of the Lord. And so this is a special exception to the law of Deuteronomy. Another possibility is that David just didn't follow the law in this case. Some people then, and some scholars or other people today, they think David just used the situation as an excuse to wipe out Saul's descendants, because then they wouldn't be a threat to his throne. Saul's descendants would always be a threat to David's throne, and so maybe he wiped them out to put an end to that. But it would be odd to me that God would relent. God's going to relent later in the story. would God relent if David had gone off the rails and done something that God found to be evil, something that was wrong? So it's troubling. A lot of the Old Testament is troubling. But is it less troubling than God sending his son Jesus to become a human and then having him suffer and die on a cross to make amends for our sins, to atone for our sins? Now we have to make amends for our sins, but we have no possible way of doing it. We're just like the Gibeonites. We have no hope of doing it. And so therefore Jesus makes amends for us. And it cost him his human life. Now he was raised from the dead before too long, so John says in 1 John 2:2 that Jesus, he is the atoning sacrifice for our sins, and not only for our sins, but also for the sins of the whole world. Well, if we need to make amends for something, we're going to have to do it without breaking other promises that we've made. And David, now he has to round up the 7 sons of Saul, and they're going to be handed over to the Gibeonites. And that's verses 7 to 9. It says, "But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the oath the Lord which was between them, between David and Saul's son Jonathan. So the king took the 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, Armoni and Mephibosheth, whom she had borne to Saul, and the 5 sons of Merab, the daughter of Saul, whom she had borne to Adriel, the son of Barzillai the Meholathite. Then he handed them over to the Gibeonites, and they hanged them on the mountain before the Lord, so that the 7 of them fell together, and they were put to death in the first days of harvest, at the beginning of the barley harvest." Now this must have happened after the events of 2 Samuel 9, because that's when David wanted to show loyal love to Saul and Jonathan, and so he gave all of Saul's lands to Mephibosheth and had him eat at his table like a son. And so because of this covenant that David made with Jonathan, he spares Mephibosheth from the 7 that he rounded up to send to the Gibeonites. But he does pick the 7 who's going to die, and there's another Mephibosheth in that list, but this one is Saul's son, while the other one is Saul's grandson, the son of Jonathan. So there's 2 of them, at least 2 of them. And so these 7 are handed over to the Gibeonites, and they're killed and they're hanged on the mountain in Saul's hometown. And so amends have been made for Saul's sin against the Gibeonites. Is that the end of the story? It's not the end of the story. So it might turn out that others will suffer because of the price that has to be made to make amends for something, and we need to consider them. Here, the mother of 2 of the 7 who were killed, she goes and she mourns at the place where they were killed, and she protects their bodies from the elements and from the critters who are coming to eat them. And it says that in verses 10 to 14. It says, "Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it out for herself on the rock from the beginning of harvest until it rained on them from the sky. And she allowed neither the birds of the sky to rest on them by day, nor the wild animals by night. When it was reported to David what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done, then David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan from the citizens of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the public square of Beth Shan, where the Philistines had hanged them on the day the Philistines struck and killed Saul in Gilboa. He brought up from there the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan, and they gathered the bones of those who had been hanged. And they buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan in the country of Benjamin in Zelah, in the grave of his father Kish. So they did everything that the king commanded, and after that, God responded to prayer for the land. Now, David, he's kind of stuck in the middle here because he's the king, and it was Saul who had done this thing and created the problem with the Gibeonites. And now there's a famine, and David has to look out for his people, the current people of Israel, and try to make the famine go away because they're going to die if they don't get food. And so he does what he has to do. He rounds up 7 sons of Saul and turns them over to the Gibeonites to be killed. And either that was okay with God, or David did what was expedient in the moment, and God let it pass. Now, have you ever done what was expedient in the moment, even though it wasn't probably what God wanted you to do? I never have, but I'm sure other people have. But now here we have these other people who paid a heavy price in order to fix the problem. And so now he's king, and he's got to look after these people too. And so he gets Saul and Jonathan's bones and the bones of these 7 that were killed, and brings them back and gives them a respectful burial. Now that doesn't bring them back, but it shows respect to them and their family, and so maybe it helped a little bit. And then notice it wasn't until after this that God responded to the prayer for the land. And so God waited until they had done all of this stuff. Well, if you're like me, you have a tendency to do things that necessitate making amends with other people. Now, when I was here at school at Western, a bunch of us broke into the snack shop over in the gym. And we stole a bunch of candy. The vice principal called us in one by one, and people confessed to what they had taken. And I was the last one to come in. And when I got there, there was like $80 or $90 worth of stuff unaccounted for. And I said, well, I didn't do that. And I didn't have to pay that. But I had to pay back for the candy that I took. Sometimes you don't even know that you need to make amends until someone comes and tells you that you offended them in some way. And then you have to find out what the offense was. And I suppose you have to figure out whether it's legitimate. They're not always legitimate. And then you've got to make amends with the other person. And you'll have to find out what it will take for for you to make amends for what you did. And it might take a little negotiation. Sometimes it won't be possible to make amends, and we'll just have to ask for forgiveness. We know more people than we should whose children are killed by drunk drivers. And sometimes they ended up going and meeting with the driver. And yeah, they're almost always he's going to go to prison probably. He's going to have financial ruin. But that's not going to be able to make any amends with the parents. There's nothing that he can do to make amends with the parents. And so the parent has to decide, they have to choose whether they're going to forgive this person who was drunk and killed their child. And we know several that did that. And, to me, that's an amazing Christ-like thing to do for someone, to forgive them when there's nothing they can do to make it right with you. In Matthew 5:23-24, near the other passage, Jesus says, when you come to worship God, to make a sacrifice in those days, and you realize that somebody has something against you, you should immediately leave the sacrifice there and go find that person and be reconciled to them. And then come back and worship God and make your sacrifice. And when you're reconciling with that other person, you may need to make amends for something that you did. It might be as simple as saying, oh, I'm sorry, I did that. There's nothing I can do to fix it, but I'm very sorry. Or you might need to do more. Now, David, he had this problem because there's a famine in Israel, and he's the king, so he's responsible. And so he learns why the famine came about because he asked God. It's because Saul killed the Gibeonites. And so he goes to the Gibeonites and says, well, what can we do to make it right with you? and they say, well, give us 7 sons of Saul and let us kill them. That's very strange to us, but David does it. Either it's an exception to the law that says sons don't die for the sins of the father, or David just does what needs to be done and ignores the law. Well, these 7 men have families. They have mothers, and they might have wives, and they might have children. But one of the mother of the 2 of them goes and she does a vigil over their bodies, protecting them from the elements and from the critters. And so when David hears about this, he goes and gets the bones of Saul and Jonathan and of these 7 men and brings them back and gives them a proper burial. And then God hears the prayers for the land. So we're not likely to be king of Israel anytime soon, or governor or president. And so we just have our little lives, but God is concerned about our little lives too. And the little things that happen in our lives are just as important to him as David and the Gibeonites. And so we've got to realize there's a problem, determine the reason for the problem, find out how to make amends with the other person for the problem that we caused, and then make amends to the other person without violating other promises that we've made. And we have to take care of those who are going to be affected by us making amends. Sometimes, I think I said that one already. There we go. So when we planted those trees, it was easy to realize what the problem was. The guy called up and said, hey, my seedlings are dying. And so we had to go look, and we discovered they hadn't been planted deep enough. And so the roots look like a J in the little channel. Obviously, that was our fault, and we figured out why it happened. We had been cranking on the top rod too much. So it was also relatively easy to make amends. We just refunded the money for the planting job and reimbursed him for the seedlings. It's easy for me to say because it wasn't my money, it was my boss's money. Now, other problems may not be so easy to discover or to make amends for, but we can ask God and talk with other people to see if a solution can be found. Jesus wants us to do this right away. He told people when they realize somebody has something against you, leave your sacrifice at the offering, at the altar, and go find the person and be reconciled with them. And we can and should do the same. So, thank you for having me. Somebody's finishing for us here.